When you step back and you think about kind of the history of education in the US, right, for 100 years, we've had a very certain type of schooling model, handles vast majority of students. It's the public school system. And now we're kind of moving towards a system where, oh, it's actually more decentralized than that. It's been incredible what's happened over the last 4 years since COVID. But I think the next 5 to 10 will have even more change as these programs launch, get off the ground, as parents get comfortable with them, as schools start to respond to the ESA demand. And so just incredibly excited to see how that works out.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Joe Connor. Joe is the founder and CEO of Odyssey, a platform that helps parents access and utilize their ESA money in states where ESA programs have passed. In today's episode, Joe and I get into the history of ESA programs and why there's been such a flurry of ESA programs passing over the past 4 years. We talk about what his interface does and how it makes it easier for parents to find and determine their eligibility and access these ESA programs. We talk about some of the biggest patterns and trends that Joe has seen in the rollout of ESAs across the country. And we talk about why Joe is so optimistic about ESAs being a huge part of the future of education in America, and why he's so optimistic that families more and more will be able to choose the best school for their kids, not just based on what happens to be available locally or is publicly funded, but that is actually the best fit for their children. It was great to catch up with Joe and have this conversation, and I hope you enjoy listening. Joe Connor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm so happy we're finally doing this. We talked about this a long time ago, and then we both got really busy.
I think this is maybe 2 years in the making. So excited.
This has been in the making since before I had a podcast.
That's true.
That's how long we've been waiting to do this. And you are really the one that's been busy because you've been in the front lines of all the school choice stuff that's been happening, and that's been keeping you incredibly on your toes as far as I can tell. Whenever we have a minute to catch up, you're always very in the weeds. I'm so excited to pick your brain about school choice stuff today. I have a lot of questions, and you know a lot about it, so we're gonna have fun here. Maybe let's just start really quickly with what you do, just for context for people. You run a company called Odyssey. What is Odyssey?
So Odyssey is the leading school choice platform for states to run their programs that help low-income families and special needs families and just families statewide who want access to a better alternative education.
And that puts you very in the front lines of everything that's happening with school choice. It's been a very hot topic for a while now, and you've kind of been in the thick of it for the duration, right? You've been at this for a while.
That's right. Almost a decade and a half. I've been in that time a teacher, led a school, started my own school network, worked on the policy and legal side for some of the very early programs that were being rolled out over a decade ago, and really started Odyssey as a result of all of those experiences. I realized that the most important thing for these policies to be successful was a good implementation and a good experience for the parents who were utilizing it. And what I found when I kind of investigated this 3 years ago were that many states were doing these programs in-house, where there were kind of slow, long, laborious manual processes that meant parents weren't getting quickly approved. Payments were delayed, there were data breaches, and no one really had a great solution at the time. And so I figured I need to go out and build one.
So can we go on the weeds on this for a second?
Let's do it.
What is a good experience for parents when they suddenly have access to school choice money, vouchers, a savings account, whatever format this money is coming in? What what should that process look like? Because it seems to me like it's something that has been, like you said, it can be messy, it can be very complicated. Oftentimes parents don't know what they have access to or that they have access to anything at all. Adoption numbers can be very slow sometimes for programs that get rolled out. It feels like there's a bottleneck here, but it's not necessarily intuitive what the solution looks like. How should this work?
So the default for these programs are that they are hard to access for parents and schools.
Is that on purpose?
I don't necessarily think that it is on purpose. The issue is when you step back, what you have is you have a policy that's been passed by the state legislature. It's assigned to an agency, and the agency has to figure out how to carry it out. And once the agency does that, they start kind of filling in all of the gaps that the law didn't address. That's essentially what state and federal agencies do. The problem becomes that every agency is tasked with kind of faithfully executing on the law as it was written and signed. What their focus is on compliance. They want to make sure that, hey, if they're saying that, these types of providers are allowed and these other ones over here are not allowed, let's make sure that the system reflects that. If it is saying that we need to, collect information, let's make sure that we're collecting as much information as possible. And so by kind of a series of steps, the default outcome for almost any government technology software is it's going to be a very complex and clunky process because there isn't often a person involved in it who's focused on what does the experience look like for our end user, the parent. And that's completely different than pretty much how every other business and startup in the country and around the world approaches a problem, which is, hey, we need to make sure that this process, whether it's, downloading and signing up for our app or, being verified and gaining access to an ESA is as easy as possible. And so what that looks like is the parent can fill out the application in under 5 minutes. They can access it via a mobile phone. They don't need a desktop or a laptop or a scanner to upload documents. They can get their eligibility determination. Are you in this program or are you out? Immediately. They can then access their funds. They have lots of different vendors, products, and services to spend it on. When they purchase something, they know with certainty that it's an eligible item and they're not going to be trapped in this back and forth with the agency over, hey, is this book or is this tool eligible for the ESA? And then the payment goes through and they receive their product or service quickly. In many industries, that would be table stakes. But the sad reality is many of the school choice programs struggle with kind of executing on these very basic principles of making sure that the program is easily accessible to parents.
How much do you think that has affected adoption of utilizing school choice? Because in many states, there is some level of school choice access, even if it's not universal. And sometimes the numbers aren't terribly high of families that are utilizing it. And sometimes even the awareness isn't that high. Like families don't know what they have access to. How much of that do you think is actually caused by the poor interfaces versus other contributing factors?
Bad platforms and poor implementation are the number one obstacle to the success of school choice programs nationwide. 4 years ago, I would have said that it was legislation, actually getting a bill together, getting sponsors for it, getting enough votes. But I think it's been pretty clear over the last 4 years that these programs are wildly popular when any group, whether it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, it cuts across gender lines, demographic lines, income lines. Everyone supports these types of programs that provide funding to parents. And so I think then if you look actually at the outcomes of how many people, now that the program is implemented, are online and using them, that's mainly a function not of the popularity, it's mainly a function of how easy is it to use these programs. And I think in states where there are very few people who have been enrolled, it's important to ask kind of tough questions of, is the platform that we're using easy for parents to access? And I think in many cases you'll find that it's not. And so we are very proud of the fact that at Odyssey, in less than 2 years, we actually run the third largest ESA program in the country in Iowa. It's the Iowa Students First Education Savings Account program. We launched it last year. We had about 17,000 people who were enrolled and approved. They found out their eligibility in seconds. Whole application took less than 5 minutes. They didn't have to upload any documentation. We could take what they input and we could verify that they met the criteria for the program. And then in another year, we've actually managed to nearly double that. And I think the major success of that, and we've run actually well ahead of very optimistic projections for the program. And I think the major reason for that is because we designed the platform, the Odyssey platform, to be as simple as possible for these parents to use. I'm a parent myself, and I know that signing up for a program like this would be just one of the many things I'm doing. It doesn't need to be something I need to take time off from work or go to a library to do. I can just do it from my phone and get approved.
What have you noticed in terms of when a school choice program rolls out in a new state? You've been present for many such occasions over the past few years. Um, what are the biggest things that you notice in terms of like the patterns of adoption? Is it the kind of thing that people know very quickly, like when it's done well, people know very quickly what's happening, where to go, whether or not they're like it makes sense to check eligibility, and then also like sensibility around what they want to use the school choice options for? Like, do people tend to have a sense of what it is they're looking for, or is sometimes people don't even know what options are available to them? I'm very curious about what you see on the ground watching this first wave of early adopters for a school choice program move through your platforms.
So I think there's a number of challenges that any new program has to address. The very first one is marketing and outreach. The ESA programs, education savings account programs, are, I'd say, by and far the most common policy that's being passed in all these states. So we'll kind of use that as an example.
Mhm.
The ESA as an idea is really only about a decade old, and in terms of real implementation for large numbers is only a few years old. And so there needs to be in any state a pretty robust marketing and outreach effort to explain to parents, hey, this is what an ESA is. This is how you sign up for it. This is how you can use it. I think oftentimes people analogize it to a health savings account because we're all pretty familiar with that. A kind of set aside amount of money that you can spend on approved educational items, or excuse me, approved healthcare items for an HSA. You're just taking that instead of personal funds, it's state funding, and instead of healthcare, it's educational. So there is kind of a big, I'd say, education component to that. And then other aspects that you need to address are really application processing and identity verification. Most of these programs will have thousands, tens of thousands of people apply in the first 24 hours. So the platform needs to be able to handle that scale. It also needs to be able to do it in an easy way for parents to quickly find out. And then I think one of the most important things is also making sure that there's no fraud, waste, and abuse, right? At the end of the day, these are government programs. They are empowering parents by giving them money into an account where the parents can direct it. And it's really important for the long-term health and success of these programs that all that money is accounted for and is spent properly. So, we're very proud of the fact that we have had an independent third party audit done of one of our programs that found 99.9% of all funds were properly spent, which is a track record I put up against anyone in our sector, and certainly is better than kind of most government programs that do have some, level of fraud, waste, and abuse.
You mentioned the kind of marketplace like component. I don't know if that's the word that you would use, but the interface where people can see, here are the things actually available to me that are approved expenses that I can use this money for. Can you talk about how that part of the program works? Because that's really interesting, or that part of the platform, rather.
Yeah, I think the best way to talk about ESAs is kind of to go back maybe 30, 35 years to where the original idea of vouchers came out of. So this is an idea that famously Milton Friedman kind of posited as one way to introduce higher quality outcomes by inducing competition in the K through 12 school sector, which typically in the US and most other countries is a monopoly, right? For most of K through 12, it's primarily provided by the public school system that is local. If they do a great job, that's fine. Parents will continue to go. If they do a bad job, parents will continue to go because there isn't really much of an alternative currently in most states. And so the voucher idea was a way to introduce competition, but vouchers were only government funding that could go to tuition of a school. And so those took off in the 90s. And then around the same time, charters also launched. And interestingly, charters kind of became, I think, a more favored policy tool. Bunch of reasons for why, but they were kind of more of a bipartisan option. There were a lot of philanthropic support. So those took off, and there really wasn't much interest in vouchers. The idea of vouchers actually then morphed into kind of tax credit scholarships, which is a way to actually get around what had been state constitutional issues that prevented vouchers in some states. This is actually, I was a practicing attorney for a while, and we did some work around these. These are called Blaine Amendments. They came about mainly in the 1800s to prevent states from funding parochial or Catholic school education. And so eventually, where private school choice has landed is actually on a very expansive policy, which are education savings accounts. And so I think it's important to kind of know that history, because an ESA can be used for tuition, but that's not the only option for it. It can also be used for tutoring. It can be used for speech therapy, audiology, behavioral therapy. It can be used on products like books or electronic hardware like a tablet or a laptop. And so from my point of view, it is kind of the ideal policy because it's so wide and expansive in terms of what parents can spend money on, but it does still have some guardrails in place. And so it really allows families in the state to kind of opt into what they think is best for their son or daughter, right? So if they want to send them to a private school, use the majority of the ESA for that. That's great. Or they can kind of customize, right? So they can choose, oh, you know what? I'm going to homeschool. We're going to use the ESA. I'm going to buy a bunch of books. We're going to buy some curriculum. They're going to go to online classes, and I'll hire a tutor. And so I think increasingly what we're seeing is that more and more parents are interested in more customization, right? I think the idea of, hey, let me send my kid to the local public school that they're zoned for. They'll enter in kindergarten, they'll graduate in 12th grade. I never have to make any other decisions besides that, is increasingly an outdated mode of education. More and more parents, I think, want to try alternatives. They're interested in homeschooling. They're interested in Montessori, Reggio Emilia. They want to try different things at different ages. So I know many families who utilize ESAs who maybe for 1 year, they'll homeschool them because that's what works for that child at that time. The parents are able to do it. And then the next year, they're putting them into a micro school. And then after that, maybe for high school, they want them to have kind of a more traditional experience. They're going to the local private traditional high school. And so I think that is kind of a great flexibility that ESAs have. And so the marketplace really is on the Odyssey platform, a place where parents can bring their dollars. Every single vendor product and service has been pre-approved. And so when they're purchasing a tutoring session or they're purchasing a tablet, they can instantly make that purchase. It'll be delivered to them, and then they can kind of go about their day. So it's just kind of the implementation aspect of the actual ESA. Where do you actually spend those dollars? You spend it in the Odyssey marketplace.
Do you notice trends in the reasons why people maybe are early adopters for ESAs? I had Jenny Clark on a few months ago, who's very active in the ESA world in Arizona. And she was talking about how it's very common for people to utilize ESAs if they have a child with some type of learning disability or special need. And so there's a very strong bias of people moving, like people who have those types of needs with their children being quicker to adopt ESAs. And so there's sort of a bias towards that in the overall market. Um, and I'm curious if there are other things that you've noticed in people coming through. Are they most often looking for particular types of schools? Is there a particular reason why they're looking for other options, or does it vary by state? What have you noticed?
So I think what we've seen is that typically a family who's utilizing an ESA is because the local school was not meeting their need for one reason or another. And so I think part of that is academic. So, my son or daughter isn't getting kind of what they need to make sufficient academic progress. Part of that has also, I think, been curriculum. Parents are concerned about what's being taught in the local school. So then they're looking for a way to opt out. Other things are parents are looking for a specific type of kind of creed or culture at the school, which is why I think many ESAs parents often take to religious schools, parochial, Christian, Jewish, what have you. Um, so, and then I'd say another category would also be kids with special needs, who, for whatever reason, find that they're not getting kind of the proper support at their local school or school district. So they can take an ESA, they can go to a specialized school, or they can kind of customize and stack an education for them. So I think in all those categories, the underlying theme that we see is that parents don't think that the local school option is the best one for their son or daughter, and that's why they are using the ESA.
Do you notice any variation by state or like even region in sort of trends in what people are moving towards or why they're moving towards? Or does it tend to be across the board, no matter where you are, it's kind of the same picture you're looking at?
So I think that it's pretty early because we only are honestly 2 years removed from the very first universal ESA. And
You're
what
still in
univer
like early adopter mode.
Exactly. Yeah, we're in, if it's a baseball game, we're in the first inning, however you want to put the analogy. But Arizona was the very first in 2022. They moved to universal. And so that happened over kind of the spring and summer of 2022. It massively expanded. And then a number of states have followed: Florida, Iowa, et cetera. I don't think we have honestly enough data to really say, hey, here are the regional things that we're seeing. But I'd say some interesting things that we're seeing are that more and more parents over time are choosing to customize their children's education. So there's actually a few studies on this from Florida, which has one of the longest operating ESAs. But typically, when a family first signs up for an ESA, they will use it primarily just as a way to pay for tuition. And then over time, as they become kind of more comfortable with the policy, and more, I think, facile with the platform, they start to kind of stack things, right? So then they'll pay for a tutoring session, they'll buy some electronic hardware. And so what I would imagine you see in these future states that are rolling them out is a similar type of pattern where parents signing up, they're using them primarily, hey, I want to go to this school, I otherwise couldn't afford it, now I can afford it with the ESA. But I think you're seeing more and more customization. And I think increasingly you're also seeing, interestingly, people respond to that. So, we spent a lot of time talking about the demand side, which is, parents and the funding that they get and kind of the choice that they have. But because we're introducing some market dynamics into education, what you're also seeing is on the supply side, schools and vendors are beginning to tailor their offerings to ESAs. So I know of many startups and companies that are beginning to market to ESA families as they kind of reach critical mass in certain states. I also know that there are lots of private schools who are trying to meet the homeschoolers where they are. So they're now offering not full-time tuition, but part-time. If someone wants to come and take classes for 2, 3 days a week, supplement their homeschool education. And so I think that's actually the most exciting thing, which is that as we empower parents and allow them to kind of make the decision that's best for their son or daughter, that increasingly there are kind of these cool options that are springing up in response to that.
This is one of the things that's most exciting to me is on the school creation side and the innovation side, seeing things start to emerge that are built very specifically for the market constraints of most families having access to ESA money. And so they can make choices within the confines of how much that cost or how much money they have access to and how they're allowed to use it. And I think that we're in the very early stages of seeing programs starting to emerge that are catering towards that. I'm very excited to see what happens on this front. It sounds to me like you're almost describing a deschooling process that families have to go through, where they're just expecting a sort of one-to-one replacement for
Mhm.
public school. And they're looking for something that's better, but they're looking for one thing to
Yes.
replace the one thing that they had before. And then they start realizing that actually there's tons of room to play and school isn't a binary. You either are in one school or you're not in school at all. And then they start playing with customizing options. This is very interesting to me. I feel like there's sort of this disassociation or like detachment from public school that's happening not just logistically but psychologically too.
I think that's right. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one is that the vast majority of students today and the vast majority of their parents did go through the K-12 schooling system, primarily public schools, where you enter, you go to your local school, right? There wasn't much choice for parents like myself who were going around in terms of charter or private school options that were publicly funded, et cetera. So this is kind of a new way of thinking about it. I think the second way is also school choice programs are misunderstood. And when ESAs are passed, they're often painted by opponents as, oh, this is vouchers, this is defunding schools, neither of which are true. But I think that that message does get repeated of like, oh, it's a voucher. I can take this and I can spend it at tuition. And I think that's kind of maybe most people's base level understanding until they actually participate in the program. Um, and then I think the third one is it really is just a sea change because look, we use the term empowering a lot, and I think we use that maybe so much that it doesn't mean anything. But when you step back and you think about kind of the history of education in the US, right, for 100 years, we've had a very certain type of schooling model, handles vast majority of students. It's the public school system, primarily supported by local and state taxes, and a little bit of federal money. And now we're kind of moving towards one in which it is everyone has, the same lesson in the first grade in Manhattan, across the 5 boroughs, no matter what. And now we're kind of moving towards a system where, oh, it's actually more decentralized than that, right? We're actually allowing parents to have funding from the state, and then those parents actually get to decide what's best for it. So I think it's actually a really exciting movement because in many ways it is just a complete sea change in how we fund education, in how we allow parents and families to navigate it. And so I think that it's been incredible what's happened over the last 4 years since COVID, but I think the next 5 to 10 will have even more change as these programs launch, get off the ground, as parents get comfortable with them, as schools start to respond to the ESA demand. And so just incredibly excited to see how that works out.
Do you have any predictions of things that places you see big gaps in the market and you expect something to fill it, or things that you think will become more commonplace? Or is it too early to hypothesize?
So I think that increasingly every state will have some version of education savings accounts. What it looks like in, say, Louisiana versus Iowa versus California will be very different. But I think one of the most kind of heartening things is, we did a poll last year with John Zogby and Zogby Associates. They're kind of prominent presidential pollers. And one of the really cool things that came out of it were just as many people in California support ESAs as Alabama, right? And so I think that we think about this as a very partisan issue, but at the end of the day, parents don't think about it as a partisan issue. That's mainly down to kind of politics and how the political parties align on school choice and political leadership. But I think over time, parents will win out. I think that's what we've seen over the last 4 years, right? During COVID, parents were forced in many cases to go into alternative education, and the system of parents actually responded remarkably well, right? Parents set up learning pods, and there were micro schools, and people did outdoor schools, and they set up, homeschooling co-ops, right? And I think what you're beginning to see is that policy is actually catching up to a lot of those changes that happened over the last 4 years, which is why we're now passing ESAs, we're now standing them up to actually support the education freedom that many families experience for the first time over the last 4 years, right? And they want more of that, and they're willing to vote in a certain way to get more of that, and they're willing to support parties and politicians on either side who give them that. And so I think we are really just at the beginning of this. So I think existing ESA programs continue to get larger. I think you see more and more providers enter the space who are offering differentiated offerings. So I think the idea of, you know, full-time enrollment at public or private school will increasingly be just one option of many. I think you'll see private schools begin to offer more part-time classes, offer more specialized classes. I think you will see rises in things that we as a country have always said we care a lot about, like career and technical education. I think you'll see more providers enter into that space. I think you'll see more parents using funding for that. And so overall, I think that one of the most exciting things about ESAs, besides empowering parents, is kind of the second order effects. If we take this funding that previously was only going to one type of schooling and parents didn't have any control over it, and we give it to parents, what are the second order effects of that? I think we're beginning to see that, right? We're beginning to see a system that's more responsive, that has more diverse choices, right? There will be more Montessori schools. There will be more religious schools. There will be more Reggio Emilia schools. People will be creating new schools, right? The idea that we can only have Maria Montessori's vision of education, which is 100 years ago, doesn't mean that someone else can come up with a whole new curriculum or pedagogy and then kind of create a network around that. So I think I'm really excited just about how much choice is going to affect education. And I think we're already beginning to kind of see that.
I think a lot of people don't have a full grasp on the scale of the school choice movement in the country right now. To your point earlier, it's still very new. The idea has been around for a while, and there's been a slow rollout in a bunch of
Mhm.
different states of moving towards universality of school choice over time. But the sweep of universal programs starting to emerge has been very recent, and it's changed very rapidly. Can you paint a picture of the current landscape, both the states that have the most robust programs right now, but also the places that, if parents are listening and they live in this state, maybe they should be paying attention because there might be something happening soon?
So I think the best way to illustrate it is to talk about the recent history. So in 2020, if we only look at ESAs, we had 4 ESAs that had been passed nationwide at the state level. And collectively, they enrolled around 25,000 students. And there were $188 million that was going out across those 4 programs. Today, when we're looking across it, we have more than 12 universal programs, which are programs that are now or will eventually be open to every single resident of those states who have K through 12 children. There's probably another 6 or 7 that are kind of variations of that: tax credit ESAs, supplemental ESAs, et cetera. And collectively, they are distributing over $4.5 billion and they have close to 1 million students who are enrolled in them. And so that's the growth in just 4 years has been massive, and most of that has been very recent. So we administer the Iowa Education Savings Account program. That is in the second year of a 3-year path to universal. It already has over 30,000 students, as has been publicly reported. Um, and next year will actually continue to grow as it actually is open to all new residents. And so I think that in terms of new programs, I think that Iowa has actually done an outstanding job. Our partners there at the state level in the governor's office, Department of Education, Department of Revenue have been fantastic to work with. Their focus has always been on the right aspects of it, which is how do we make an easily accessible program for parents and schools? And how do we make sure that we have no fraud, waste, and abuse? And that really is kind of the key metrics that we should be focused on for a successful program. Are parents using it? And are they using it the way that they're supposed to on educational expenses, right? It's pretty simple. You can look at other metrics, but ultimately, show me how many people are on the program and I'll show you how good of a job you've done with implementation. And so I think they've done a fantastic job. And really, most of the legislative activity has happened over the last 2 to 3 years. An interesting thing has been in 2021, people declared it was the year of school choice because so many programs passed. 2022 came about, they passed even more programs. And then 2023, we passed even more. And so I think every year there's more and more of these programs coming to pass and more being implemented. And the programs will continue to grow and enroll significant percentages of students in these states. And so what you're seeing kind of when you step back is in the US, we spend across state, local, and federal funding, we spend about $800 billion annually from governments at the K through 12 level. And what we're seeing with ESAs is kind of a policy that is taking those funds away from kind of centralized decision makers at a school district office, giving it to parents, and allowing them to choose what works best. And so, once again, I think that's kind of the really exciting part as these states grow these programs. There's going to be an ecosystem of vendors and schools within that state that respond to it. I think a great example of that um, is in Iowa, where in the first year of the program, we had 190 private schools who enrolled in the program. And in the second year, we had about 215. And some of those were new schools who were jumping in, who had seen kind of the demand and wanted to get started. And there are, a number of schools that I think will open in the years to come in response to kind of that parent demand.
What happened in the past 4 years? Why did this movement suddenly pick up so much traction?
So I think there's one major reason, which is that during COVID, everyone's schooling was disrupted, whether you lived in a red state or blue state, right? Schools were shut down, schools went online, schools made lots of changes. And what that caused were parents to really look critically at the education that their son or daughter were getting, and in many cases were unhappy with it. Some were unhappy with it because of the quality of it. They didn't think it was particularly high quality. Other parents were upset about the fact that it was remote, right? Especially in northeastern states, there was a big push to get back into school, and that took months or in some case years. Other people were unhappy with the curriculum or the content or the way it was being taught. And so coming out of COVID, the vast majority of parents who have been forced into alternatives did go back to what they were previously doing. I mean, if you look at charts of homeschooling, for example, there was a huge surge in 2020 and 2021, and then kind of a reversion to the mean. But what you've seen is that not everyone went back, and there was a significant portion who continued to seek out alternatives, and that even for families that went back to their zone school, I think they are much more open to the idea of choice and to alternatives than they otherwise would have been, because they found that their local school maybe wasn't everything that they wanted and hoped it would be. So I think absolutely these policies are a direct result of COVID and kind of what parents saw in their son or daughter's education.
And it's picked up quite a bit of political traction. I believe it was in Texas, there were 21 Republicans that were opposing school choice, and only 7 of them won their primaries after making clear that they didn't support school choice. It's very politically charged. People really, really care. And it's very exciting to see how much people care after public school just sort of being the default for so long. The fact that so many people are hungry for options is very exciting. You mentioned the 3-year rollout that Iowa is utilizing, or the 3-year path to universality. And that's pretty common across states. Can you talk a little bit about what the process usually looks like? Because most states don't go from 0 to 100 in
Correct.
terms of access.
Yes, that's right. So I think once again, helpful to look at the history here. So Arizona was the very first state that passed an ESA about a decade ago. When it first passed, it had narrow eligibility bands.
It was mostly for kids with learning disabilities, right?
It actually kind of became over time a grab bag of different things. So special needs was kind of one of
Okay.
the initial ones. Then it was also for sons or daughters of first responders. It also included
Mm.
certain members of Native American tribes, certain people zoned for failing schools, and so over time they added to it and added to it, and it slowly grew. And then right before it was universal, it was around 12,000 across all those eligibility criteria.
12,000 like available spots
No,
or
12,000
criteria.
students who had signed up and were enrolled and utilizing the
Okay.
ESA.
Got
And
it.
then it was the very first universal expansion that passed in 2022. And over the course of the summer, it basically grew nearly 5 times the size and was at 50,000 by the fall of 2022. Um, there were a lot of, I think, growing pains from all of a sudden, uh, going from 12,000 to 50,000. And so I think increasingly what most states have decided to do is actually have a kind of step rollout where each year you're adding more people to the program. And so I think um, Iowa has actually kind of led the country in that. And increasingly it's a model that others are looking at. But for example, both Iowa and Arkansas, which were passed the same year, have a 3-year path to universal. In Iowa, it's based primarily on income. So in the first year, it was 300% or below of the federal poverty level were parents who were eligible for it, and then increased to 400%. And the next year will be open to anyone, regardless of their income. Arkansas had a similar 3-year rollout, but they did kind of more distinct groups as like special needs and others can apply for it. And that's increased over time. So I think from a policy point of view, the idea was we want to make sure that the states have capacity to roll this out over time and that state agencies can actually do it in a meaningful way. And we don't want to just have it be 100,000 people from day one. And so that's increasingly has been, I think, the kind of reasonable approach that many people take to rolling out a new program.
Do you see common areas of pushback that make it hard for states to get an ESA bill over the finish line, or that sort of concerns that people tend to have about it being about its implementation? I know I mean you read all sorts of different takes on why ESAs are a bad idea, everything from people in rural areas being concerned that if the school is a primary employer and there aren't other education options in the local area, if 10% of the kids want to be in virtual schools and then all of a sudden the school's funding is getting cut, but there's nowhere else in person for everyone else to go. There's concerns about that. For obvious reasons, the teachers' unions are not really big fans of of ESAs and get very politically involved in making sure that the right people are in place to oppose it. Um, there's lots of there are lots of economic incentives in different areas to keep the school status quo at its equilibrium. I'm curious what the biggest things are that you run into or have seen in the work that you do.
So we typically take over after the bill has been passed and we've been selected through an open procurement process to do implementation. So at that stage, there are less, I'd say, political concerns because the majority of it actually happens, here is this bill. Let's introduce it in the House. Let's debate it, right? The media gets involved and back and forth. People write op-eds, there's rallies, et cetera. So yeah, that is a very, I'd say, political process. Um, I would say though that the thing that has given me the most hope with that is one, I mean, increasingly you are seeing these programs pass nationwide. More schools have it now than had it last year. More schools have it now, or excuse me, more states have it now than had it in 2020. And I think the second thing is, although it's portrayed as partisan, that doesn't actually correlate with the data of surveys of parents who indicate across political parties that they support these programs. And secondly, it also doesn't necessarily always equate to how members vote. And so, for example, Louisiana recently passed an education savings account program, and that did have bipartisan support for it. But I think the most important thing is, regardless of how it's passed, everyone does support an implementation that's going to be easily accessible for parents, that moves money in a timely manner, and is free of fraud. So what we kind of look at our job as is to come in and really kind of as technocrats, make sure that this program is implemented according to the highest standards and complies with everything in the law and what the agency requires, and is easily accessible for those parents.
I think that there are a lot of conflicting opinions about how extensively school choice will actually be implemented. I think some people are very worried about the extent to which it will be implemented, and other people are worried in the inverse. This is going to be available and most people are still going to be stuck in public schools. Do you have a sense, like, you're seeing trends of implementation and some of these sound very tied to the logistical constraints? Like, Iowa's is scaling up every year because they're expanding their capacity to handle students. But in states like Arizona, where the universal access was available right from the onset in 2022, we didn't see a huge drop off in public school enrollment. The numbers were not that high. I forget the exact number of students that were enrolled in the first year in Arizona and that are enrolled currently, but it's not, or you mentioned the number that was enrolled from the onset. You said it was 50,000 right at the beginning. I don't remember how many it is. I don't remember the numbers from this past school year, but it's a small fraction of the percentage of kids who are eligible, which is every child in the state of Arizona. Do you have a sense about what the factors are that affect how extensively school choice access is taken advantage of? Is there some element of lack of knowledge or lack of social acceptance or comfort with the status quo or loyalty to the status quo system? Is there a knowledge problem where families just don't really understand what they have available to them and how to use it? Is it just kind of the same thing that happens with the early adoption of any new product, where it just takes the outliers adopting the thing and using the thing and proving that it's okay to do the thing that then is going to slowly lead to more traction as more customers follow, like sort of crossing the chasm problem of any new startup trying to get there their products adopted. Do you have a sense of what I know this is a very complicated question. Like we could spend 2 hours just
Yeah.
on this. We're digging into the psychology of the American mind when it comes to education. This is a big question. But I'm curious if you have a sense because you spend so much time around families, you're talking to the lawmakers who are implementing these. They're obviously being influenced by the desires of their constituents. You're talking to people who are building schools and programs that are then being paid for by ESA money and customers who are employing ESAs. Like you have a really interesting cross-sectional view of a lot of the different variables at play in this story. And I'm curious if you've seen things or have a take on why the implementation sometimes is slower than one might think, like why some families make the leap but many families stay. What do you see here?
So I think there's a couple of things that states need to get right in order for school choice programs to be successful and to continue to be
Mhm.
successful in the future. I think the first one is the reason that Odyssey exists, which is historically these programs have been difficult for parents to navigate. There's been slow payments, there's been fraud, waste, and abuse. You require parents to upload numerous documents that they have to go and find. There's back and forth. It takes weeks or months. That's why we built Odyssey. It's to make it as simple and easy as possible for parents to sign up and to access ESA funding so that they can get their son or daughter into a high quality education. That's it. That's the number one reason that we exist. It's why I founded the company. It's why everyone works so hard at Odyssey to make sure we're delivering on that mission. But I think that that's necessary but not sufficient for school choice to continue to grow. I think we also have to make sure that on the policy side, we maintain policies that are simple. Uh, if we add complexity to it, it means that it's harder for parents to access. It doesn't mean that there can be no rules or regulations, but they need to be common sense. They need to be focused on ensuring funds are properly spent. They shouldn't be overly prescriptive or require large amounts of paperwork. For parents to continue to utilize the program, right? So I think the second thing beyond the platform is that policy, right? In states where we've passed it, we need to make sure that we're maintaining the policy, that we are putting in place common sense regulations and not over regulating it. And then finally, I think the third thing is supply, right? In many states, these programs can plateau if all they're doing is backfilling existing seats at already existing private schools. And so I think the continued growth of these programs will come from new schools being opened, not just existing schools backfilling, right? And so I think that that is another condition that needs to be met for states to continue to grow with these school choice policies. So we need new operators of private schools. We need new types of models that are offering not just full-time enrollment, but part-time enrollment. We need things like micro schools and learning pods and co-ops. We need to make sure that policies are written to allow those types of options. We need to make sure that um, there aren't barriers to entry for those schools. I mean, a big part of the issue on the supply side is actually zoning in many cities and towns can prevent people from opening up new schools. Health and fire and safety codes can make it very difficult for a school to open an existing place rather than having to go out and raise funds and build a new site. And so all of those things I think are important, focused on making sure the platform is easily accessible, making sure that the policy is simple and able to be implemented, and then finally focusing on supply and making sure that we're continuing to provide supply in response to increased demand.
You mean all the things that people who come on the podcast and talk about the schools that they're building are creating. We need more of those is what you're saying.
100%. Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the most exciting things to come out of COVID is the fact that there is now, I'd say, a more robust community that existed uh, than existed prior to COVID that is exploring new ways of schooling, is experimenting and innovating and opening new schools of choice, whether they participate in these programs or not. But I think you're just seeing kind of this explosion of education entrepreneurship. And I think we need more of that to make sure that we are meeting parents where they are. And hopefully, these ESA policies do allow more of those successful schools to take off and continue to grow.
You have a couple of kids, and you spend a lot of time thinking about different schooling models with the work that you do. Are there any that you're particularly excited about when you think about educating your own kids?
Yes. So I think up until I was probably doing this work for the first time 15 years ago, I really didn't have much experience with kind of the Montessori method or approach to schooling. So I really kind of respect that and really appreciate that. The ability to have kids in a environment where they're not being infantilized, but are actually kind of being treated as independent learners who can, decide for themselves what to do is really exciting. I've also recently kind of delved more into some of the curriculum around Reggio Emilia and have been kind of excited by that too. So you know, being in this job helps to kind of scratch like an intellectual curiosity where I do get to talk to really interesting people who are running really innovative schools on a daily basis and kind of learn what it is that they're doing. And outside of the schooling world, I mean, I also think that there is an incredible amount of great work being done on the artificial intelligence side of people kind of starting new tools that are helping teachers lesson plan, that are helping tutor kids autonomously. I think that there's a lot of kind of mm, really exciting innovations that are happening. And I do think that ESAs are kind of one of the great ways to unlock those innovations by really allowing parents and consumers to dictate where those funds go rather than a centralized school district, which is going to make a purchasing decision based on, maybe kind of what's best for them, but not necessarily the student or the parent or the family.
Why education in the first place? You said at the beginning that you've bounced between all of these different education endeavors prior to landing on Odyssey, and that Odyssey is sort of a culmination of everything that you saw along the way. But why this in the first place?
I guess I truly believe that education is the most important thing that a society can choose to invest in for its future. And the reason I've worked for different organizations and in different roles for them has really been to try to find what is the best policy that we can advocate for that empowers families with high quality education. And so a lot of kind of my journey has been on exploring different policy ideas. And so I started really in kind of the charter school world, working for kind of two great organizations there. Um, and learned an incredible amount, and then kind of moved more into private school where I saw that that was actually allowed kind of families more freedom. And then, my experience running my own school network and seeing kind of how families responded to COVID really pushed me towards education savings accounts. And I really think that from a policy point of view, they have an incredible ability to be flexible to families' needs while also making sure that they are safeguarding state funds by kind of tracking where dollars are spent. And so I think that as we kind of look around at the K through 12 school system and we see that there's huge gaps and deficiencies across the country and within cities, everyone should really seriously be looking at education savings accounts as a potential policy tool to help fight those gaps and also just the learning loss that was caused by COVID and is kind of on every single standardized test and metric that we're seeing come back has been really detrimental to an entire generation of kids. And we need to figure out how to fix that. And I don't think that the same policy answers that we have been utilizing for decades are going to work here. We need to look at different options.
Do you think there's a realistic version of the future where every state in America has universal school choice and every student is able to choose the school that is the best fit for them, not the most convenient one for their local, like everybody kind of amalgamated in their town or in their region. Is that inside the realm of possibility?
Yes. I am probably a born optimist saying that, but I do think that when I look at all of the trends that are happening in education, I think that that actually is the most likely outcome, even though it may seem at first glance to be kind of a long shot. And I think the reason it's a couple things, right? We're seeing alternatives, and alternatives being micro schools, learning pods, homeschooling, increase even in the absence of ESA support. So there's clearly a demand for something that's different. It spiked during COVID and has continued to increase at a much higher rate. We're seeing a lot of supply creation with new networks, networks like Primer or Acton Academy or KaiPod spring up in response to those. You're seeing more entrepreneurial activity of teachers and parents starting their own schools in response to being unhappy with the local school. And then I think increasingly, I mean, every single survey that is done shows that across political lines, across demographic lines, parents support these. And so, although right now there may be a very strong blue state, red state divide, I think over time, this becomes a more bipartisan type of policy. And I think that that's already here today. It's just at the voter level and isn't necessarily reflected at the party or political leadership level. And I think increasingly these programs might show up differently, say, in a California or New York at first, right? Maybe it is a program that is focused on, say, mental health or focused on supplemental activities after school. And it's only over time that it then turns into kind of a full ESA. But yes, I do think that it's a great policy tool. I think that it makes parents very happy. It really empowers them. And I think that, historically we have had bipartisan support for education reform before. I mean, I worked in the charter school sector and both Democrats and Republicans support that. And so I'm optimistic that that happens again.
If people want to know more about what you're doing or they want to hear more from you, where would you send them next?
So I am on Twitter at Joseph J. Connor. These days, I'm not the most active tweeter.
But when you are, it's really good.
Thank you. I do need to, with 2 kids in a company, it falls down on the list of priorities. But there's kind of lots of information there about what it is. If you want to learn more about Odyssey, you can visit us, www.withodyssey.com. And yeah, feel free also just to reach out to me directly at joe@withodyssey.com. Pretty available and can get back to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time for this. I'm so glad that this finally happened. This has been really fun.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.